On this segment of The Scene, we're going to talk to Glenn Gould, the long-distance piano player whose musical sprints and high jumps are well known. But first, let's hear from one of Mr. Gould's secret passions, Petula Clark.
You're the life and soul of the party, baby. A clown is what you wanted to be. You're the life and soul of the party, baby. But everybody's laughing at me. Anytime you're walking out with me, you can bet your life is bound to be pretty girls around to catch your eye. You can never let them pass you by. You're the life and soul of the party, baby. A clown is what you wanted to be. You're the life and soul of the party, baby. But everybody's laughing at me. We'll be sitting in a movie show, then you see somebody else you love, so you walk away to say hello and forget me till it's time to go. You're the life and soul of the party, baby. A clown is what you wanted to be. You're the life and soul of the party, baby. But everybody's laughing at me. There are times I really think you could be mine, and it seems that everything is fine. But I know you're not the one for me. Just the way you are, it's plain to see. You're the center of attraction in a crowd, and to interrupt you never is allowed. So we laugh at all the jokes you told before. You don't know you're really nothing but a bore. Yeah. You're the life and soul of the party, baby. A clown is what you wanted to be. You're the life and soul of the party, baby. But everybody's laughing at me. You're the life and soul of the party, baby. A clown is what you wanted to be. You're the life and soul of the party, baby. But everybody's laughing at me.
Petula Clark singing The Life and Soul of the Party.
Tickety go, let the world go by. Tickety go, we march along the highway. Say goodbye to sorrow. There's always tomorrow to pick up the day.
Remember when vaudeville was in vogue, the roaring 20s, Broadway in the 30s, the good old days of radio? If you do, and even if you don't, but are curious about what made these eras great, listeners, young and old, are invited to revisit the past with CBC Radio's Remember When. Remember When is informal and relaxing, focusing on entertainment of yesteryear, music, films, comedy, popular personalities, styles, and eras. Be sure to join host Harry Elton for the best in nostalgic entertainment on Remember When, heard every week on most of the CBC network stations.
That was the prelude number 10 in E minor from Book 2 of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, played by Glenn Gould. And we'll be talking to pianist Glenn Gould and a cast of thousands coming up on The Scene.
Surprise! Surprise! Eaton's is having a holiday surprise sale on Monday. That means hundreds of surprise sale items. Prices to save you 15 to 50%. Look for the big red balloons that point out the bargains on everything from fashions to furniture, notions to sporting goods. Go down, look around. You'll be surprised with the savings throughout all Eaton stores in Toronto and Bramalea. It's a big bargain blow-up. Eaton's holiday surprise sale, Thanksgiving Monday.
Vasiliev goes back of the net. Cornelier steals it. A pass in front. Henderson was upended as he tried to shoot it. Here's another shot. Henderson right in. He scores! Henderson!
And that's the way it ended. The historic confrontation between the national teams of Canada and the Soviet Union had been resolved by the narrowest of margins, a one-game lead for our side. The Soviet squad could take some comfort from an overall lead of 1 in gold production, but for the time being at least, Canadian honour had been preserved on ice. One result of the series will undoubtedly be a re-evaluation by the hockey moguls of the Western world of the intricate, anti-individualistic playmaking of the Russian team. Another result has been the decision by the production team responsible for The Scene to commission the following comments on the games from Glenn Gould.
Thank you, Harry.
Not at all, but allow me to read that last line again with appropriate italics. To commission the following comments on the games from Glenn Gould.
Do you presume to question my competence in the field, sir?
In the field, perhaps not, but in the gondola, as Foster Hewitt might say, I most certainly do.
May I remind you, sir, that no red-blooded Canadian boy could be oblivious to the high stakes devolving upon the Russia-Canada confrontation.
No, that's quite true, but since you're presumably not just here to ice the puck, as we say at penalty-killing time, I can only assume, Glenn, that you're about to fire a slap shot at some particular goal of your own.
That I am, Harry.
Well, why don't we have a face-off then and see who gets control of the puck?
Fair enough. Actually, I do have a particular angle that I want to play, and
Which I, as the opposition goalie, will of course attempt to cut off.
Okay, but I got to warn you that from long years of practicing glissandi, I've got a mean backhand, so watch it on the rebounds.
Well, may I suggest that before you get any further offside and we run out of double entendres, that you get to the point.
Well, I would, but my left winger isn't paying attention.
Never end.
Okay, I'll stop ragging the puck and get down to business. You're quite right, Harry. I do have an angle. I'm opposed to competitive sport, and I
To
feel...
all competitive sport?
Practically all of it, yes.
But surely, Glenn, you're not going to equate an almost sedentary, certainly intellectual pastime like chess, for example, with, well, let's take the obvious polarity, with a championship fight.
I certainly am. May I recall for you the immortal words of one Bobby Fischer, and I quote, "I like to see them squirm. I want to crush their egos." As a matter of fact, one of the great Fischer aficionados is a man who also happens to double as a music critic for the New York Times.
You mean Harold Schoenberg?
Right, and as you probably know, Schoenberg spent the summer in Reykjavik.
Yes, I saw some of his dispatches.
And I think he started out by proclaiming Fischer the Mozart of chess.
The implication being, I suppose, that Fischer brings a pure classical symmetry to bear on his chess style.
Right, that was the implication, yes. But by the end of the summer, he was calling Fischer the Beethoven of chess. Matter of fact, I'm surprised he didn't manage to dub Spassky the Cherubini of chess or the Salieri of chess or something while he was at it. But anyway, he decided to upgrade Fischer because he claimed to have discovered qualities of Beethoven-like innovation in Fischer's variational play.
And I dare say a certain common egomania played its part in the parallel.
I'm sure it did. But the fascinating, indeed to me the horrifying thing, was that after bracketing Beethoven and Fischer, Schoenberg wrote a summating article for the Times, an intensely admiring article as far as Fischer was concerned, under the title Psychic Murder at the Chessboard.
Oh, but Glenn, surely this chap Schoenberg was simply playing word games.
I mean, don't think so, Harry. I grant you that some years ago I applied myself to a rather facetious article which analysed Mr. Schoenberg's critical prose style because I'd noticed that to an extraordinary extent adjectives normally associated with sports in general and pugilism in particular found their way into his descriptions of concert experiences, which is perhaps understandable in view of the fact that he began his career behind the sports desk.
But surely that's his problem, and not a valid comment on competition per se.
Oh, but it is, you see, because my argument isn't really about sports. My argument is about the whole phenomenon of the competitive fact. You know, much as I abhor that title...
Psychic Murder.
At the chessboard, right, I do think it's singularly evocative. I'm not prepared to concede that the damage done to the ego, as Bobby Fischer would put it, of Petrosian or Bent Larsen or Spassky or anybody else who has felt compelled to exchange pawns with Fischer in the last few years, is, other than as a difference in kind, in any way distinct from the more easily quantifiable damage of the prize fight, for example.
Come on now, Glenn. Boris Spassky didn't end up out on his feet with an X-rayable concussion and the likelihood of scar tissue.
How do you know he didn't psychologically? How do you know that the stress of those, how many did they play?
21 games.
Of those 21 games couldn't be or hasn't been responsible for metabolic changes in his system. And in Fischer's, for that matter. We can't assume that victors are immune, you know. Every bit as drastic, at least in their ultimate physical results, as those suffered by any punch-drunk fighter. You see, I'm convinced that the distinction that you're trying to make, Harry, the distinction between, well, observable and physical damage, and the more insidious psychological damage of theoretically more genteel competitive enterprises like chess, I'm just convinced that that distinction is a peculiarly Occidental one.
How do you mean, Glenn?
Well, I think it's part of the Occidental willingness to separate the word from the deed, you know?
Sticks and stones and so on.
Exactly. There's some evidence for the fact that, well, as a matter of fact, McLuhan talks about just that in the Gutenberg Galaxy, that pre-literate people or minimally literate peoples are much less willing to permit that distinction.
Well, there's also the biblical injunction to will evil is to accomplish evil.
Precisely. And so all legal considerations aside, I don't think you can distinguish between Mr. Schoenberg's psychic murder at the chessboard and actual, if not necessarily intentional, murder in the ring or any other kind of murder for that matter. I'm convinced that one impulse, domination obviously, however sublimated it appears, however genteel, underlies all of those manifestations. And in every case, its form, its excuse, its access to evil, so to speak, is competition.
Wow, a thesis is born. Am I to assume, then, that you see the competitiveness of sport as a metaphor for other types of competition in life as well?
Absolutely, and that's precisely the point I want to pursue.
Well, before you pursue it, may I play you a brief interview that I taped earlier this week?
Oh, of course.
Well, when I heard that you were going to talk about sports and so on, I had a sneaking suspicion that you'd hold forth rather negatively on the subject. And it seemed to me that in the interest of fair play, which is probably not one of your favorite expressions, that we should give some celebrated sports figures a chance to assess their reaction to the sort of work they do and the sort of drives that compel them to do it.
Why not?
Well, Glenn, you mentioned pugilists a while back, and I felt sure you'd get onto that tack, so I interviewed the up-and-coming young Canadian welterweight Domenico Pastrano in the studio, and here's an excerpt. Domenico, I guess I should congratulate you first of all, because I understand that according to Ring magazine, you're now ranked number 9 in the world in your division.
Oh, geez, Mac, you must be reading some real out-date issues, you know, because, like, right now I'm listed as number 7. And
Well, in that case, congratulations are in order, Domenico.
yeah, I'm number 7 right now, and I think it's a pretty good chance that next month's issue it could be either number 5 or 6, actually.
That's really a remarkable achievement.
Yeah.
Certainly very few Canadian boxers have ever reached as high a rating as that.
Yeah, I think you can pretty well count them, like, on the fingers of one fist, you know, them that's done the better, because it's a pretty political thing, and being number 7 in the world and all that, you know.
Well, now, just what do you mean by political, Domenico?
Well, like most of the guys that are up in front of me, supposedly that is, they don't want to mess with me because they know I'm pretty good and pretty fast, and like they know they got a lot to lose, losing to me, you know.
And very little to gain, I see.
Yeah, that's about it. Yeah.
So what you're saying, Domenico, is that for the moment at least, you're confined to bouts with numbers 8, 9, and 10.
No, you got me all wrong, Mike. Because them guys are just trying to move up the ladder at my expense, you know. I mean, I don't see no reason I should give them a helping hand, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I see.
I mean, like, I'm getting a pretty good example of the sort of thing I'm talking about, you know, because, like, just that day, my manager's from the States, you know, and he was talking about the president down there, you know, Mr. Nixon. He was saying to me that I got to start thinking to myself like that, like Mr. Nixon, you know, because Nixon is like the champ, you know, or maybe considering the Russians and all, might be the leading contender. I mean, I don't know exactly how to rate him, but anyway, he's pretty high up. And,
Well, he's certainly the champ of his particular division.
oh, sure. Well, like, I mean, I don't want you to think I'm comparing myself to him, you know, because I know I'm just number 7 in the world and all that. But, like, the point I was going to make, like, which my manager was making with me, is that, like, with this guy,
McGovern, George McGovern.
yeah, that's the guy. Well, like with him, I mean, but we're stupid for Nixon to come out and fight, you know, because the main thing is that when you're the champ, you got no place to go but down. Am I right?
Well, your point is certainly well taken, Domenico. There is one question, however, I'd like to ask you, if I may.
Sure.
Well, I've often noticed that our leading sports columnists categorize you as a boxer rather than a fighter. In other words, they usually dwell upon the elegance and deftness of your movements in the ring, and in that regard you're frequently compared to Muhammad Ali,
Yeah, that's a pretty fair comparison.
rather than to Joe Frazier, for example. And the comment that I've noticed again and again in regard to your style is that you have a balletic grace in the ring. And I was wondering whether classical ballet had played any part in your life, or whether any particular dancers have influenced you.
Well, like, I ain't never gone in for that sort of thing too much, you know. But I remember one time on the Ed Sullivan show, I think it was, there was a guy, I think he might have been from Russia, maybe named Rudy something or other.
Oh, Rudolf Nureyev, perhaps.
Yeah, could have been. And, like, I noticed with him, but there was a certain similarity with my style, you know.
Well, that's exactly what I was getting at, Domenico.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, he was real fast, and his reflexes seemed to be okay, you know. And, like, when another dancer was coming toward me, give him the slip pretty good. But, like, main thing I noticed about his style, you know, is that he kept out of the corners most of the time. I mean, he was mostly in the center of the ring, the center of the stage, I guess you have to call it. And, like, with my style, where I got a lot of speed and I'm up against guys, which are pretty awkward probably, but maybe kind of dangerous in the clinches, you know, you got to stay out of the corners, see. And, like, with that guy in Europe, I couldn't help noticing he kept out in center territory practically all the time. So I was pretty impressed by that, you know.
That's quite a trophy.
Yes, it's a revealing interview, I think.
Dare I ask whether you have any similar goodies in the icebox?
Well, no expense was spared this week, Glenn. We even ran up quite a telephone bill, as
Really?
you'll hear. But I do believe we covered all the bases, if you'll pardon the expression.
That's way below the belt, sir.
Could I interest you in the proposition that a viable alternative exists to the man versus man, team versus team stratagems of competitive athletics?
You're going to tell me that man against himself, against the clock, against Mother Nature is the answer, I suppose.
Well, it does represent an alternative athletic lifestyle, and earlier in the week, I had a chat, more or less on that subject, with Jonathan Winan.
The BBC producer?
And by no coincidence whatever, one of his country's leading track stars.
Well, that I would like to hear.
Mr. Winan, this is Harry Brown. I'm with The Scene in Toronto, Canada, and
Oh, yes. The post arrived on time, and I got your invite, so I was rather expecting the call, actually.
Well, I'm delighted that you're willing to grant us an interview,
Yes.
Mr. Winan. But before we get to the subject of your athletic endeavors,
Right.
I would like to ask you about one facet of all your recent productions which has fascinated me, and which I can safely say has intrigued most of the TV reviewers in this country.
Indeed.
And that is, of course, your persistent use of motives drawn from Czech, or perhaps I should say Bohemian literature.
Oh, quite, yes, right.
I mean, we had, first of all, your absolutely dazzling 26-week series, Civilization of the Newt, which was, of course, based on the work of Karel Čapek.
Yes, but it was a terrible war to produce, actually. As you know, virtually all of it takes place beneath sea level, and the location shots were a pain, quite frankly. We all got the bends at one time or another, and Sir Kenneth, of course, is a stickler for detail and an absolute brick as well as based on trooper indeed, I might say. But he does have this thing about working below 6 fathoms, it seems. So quite often we ended up with Lloyd Bridges as the stand-in and simply set up a voiceover, but I really shouldn't tell you that, old boy, so please don't bet.
Well, it was a revelation in terms of production technique, nonetheless, sir. But it must have been a relief to you personally to get to work on the much more intimate 6 Wives of Gregor Samsa.
Yes, well, of course, one's fascination with Kafka does grow apace, doesn't it? I mean, it was an enormous challenge to search out a visual counterpart to his imagery, but I must confess to you that there's much that I do differently where I give him the chance again. I really don't think that Vanessa quite worked as a praying mantis. She's a very dear girl. Her father's an old friend, and I must say I thought Lynn was absolutely splendid as the knocker at the castle door, but then one is never satisfied, is one?
No, indeed. May I ask you what you have in store for us this coming season?
Well, I'm going to attempt an original script called Asymptotica, which is, in effect, what the Schoenbergians would term a retrograde inversion of the Kafka theme.
Well, I'm afraid you're going to have to help me out with some of those terms, Mr. Winan.
Oh, quite. Well, as I understand it, and mind you, I'm no musician, retrograde inversion simply suggests the theme rendered upside down and backwards at the same time. I must say that I find musical terms enormously helpful in clarifying one's relation to symbolic structure, don't you know? And as far as the title itself, Asymptotica, goes...
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that.
It's the most rightful ostentation, really, but I find it absolutely irresistible because what it defines mathematically is the proposition of non-intersecting lines, you'll see. But I've adapted it to describe a diminution of movement in relation to one's previous best efforts and employed it to suggest that by adopting as a yardstick the ratio of that diminution, that one is, in effect, absolutely impotent in relation to any finite goal.
Well, now, you're going to have to give me an example of that, I'm afraid, Mr. Winan.
Well, it is a bit of a muddle, isn't it? But let me try to explain as best I can. Let's imagine that you and I are standing in the center of, well, what shall we say, of a room, perhaps, and with a bunny rabbit standing between us. Then let's imagine that the nearest doorway is, what shall we say, 15 feet away. Well, now, for some ridiculous reason, the bunny rabbit decides that you and I represent a threat to his survival, and he manages to jump half of the way towards the door, towards the only escape hatch that he sees, towards freedom, as he reckons it, you see. Then, because his resources are depleted, let's say, through exertion or nerves, or metaphorically through the aging process, whatever you will, in his second attempt, he's only able to cover half the distance of the first. In other words, 3 3/4 feet, that's against 7.5. And then his third jump is similarly halved, and so on ad infinitum. Well, the unfortunate creature never will, in fact, reach the door, you see.
Oh, yes, I understand the phenomenon mathematically, but what I don't quite understand is its connection with the themes of your previous TV work, Mr. Winan.
Well, of course, one doesn't like to be backed into corners in an interview, and especially about work in progress. As a matter of fact, you're a naughty boy for asking, actually. But I did say it was a retrograde inversion of the Kafka theme, and what I tried to convey by that was that whereas in Kafka the principal themes are upwardly mobile, as you North Americans like to say, though ultimately, of course, built upon the quicksand of despair, as I remarked to a chap from the Listener just the other day.
That's a remarkably apt description.
Oh, thanks awfully. I rather fancied it myself, actually. But as I say, Kafka's themes are upwardly mobile in the sense that the castle always is at least one mountaintop beyond the author's telescopic lens, so to speak.
Yes, that's very true.
In Asymptotica, I wanted to shape a mirror image of the same kind of quest. Quest every bit as fixated by frustration, don't you see, but dominated by the supposition that one's interior landscape, in this case, the room in which the bunny rabbit is standing and the doorway of which he sees quite clearly, is every bit as inaccessible in relation to one's ultimate aspirations. Of course, I have no idea whether it will come off as one would wish. The hair's been frightful to Crane because his natural response was to jump at least 16 feet at first go, which, of course, leaves us all out of frame on the opening shot. But we're going to try some slow-motion technique with him, so perhaps it will all come out in the wash. One really doesn't know at this stage.
Well, Mr. Winan, I can only say that I feel both honored to have been privy to such insights into your working methods and just a bit guilty for having persuaded you to talk perhaps prematurely about those fascinating production techniques.
Oh, dear boy, you really mustn't fret. I've carried on in quite the same way over tea more times than I care to count, actually. But it is a very real danger, you know, talking about one's methods and all that. Rather like the centipede who was asked in what order he moved his 100 legs, and never having given it a thought previously, couldn't move at all thereafter, so one really must take care, mustn't one?
Well, your reference to the centipede and his 100 legs brings me to the other purpose of this call, Mr. Winan.
Oh, yes.
Well, we've all read about your extraordinary achievements in the area of track and field.
I say, well, that's hardly worth the price of the call, old boy. I'm no Roger Bannister, I assure you, though he's an old and very dear friend.
Well, your modesty is legendary, of course, Mr. Wynan, but it is remarkable that a man as deeply involved in probing the collective psyche of mankind through literary and visual symbols should engage in such an extrovert activity as track, and consistently manage to better the 4-minute mile in the bargain.
Well, quite frankly, old chap, I don't find the two activities at all irreconcilable. On the contrary, they're theme and counter-theme, if I may borrow from my musical friends once again.
Of course.
Well, you see, if you're fortunate enough to stumble onto a proper metaphor for the futility of life through your art, and I do feel I can claim to have staked out some rather worthwhile territory in that area.
No question of that, sir.
Well, then, one tends to become hypnotized by one's own metaphoric conceits, often as not, you know. That's the problem with art, really. You see, it takes such very indirect routes to achieve quite ordinary destinations, often as not. And I think this is because we stopped believing in magic years back. Well, perhaps younger chaps today have come back to it a bit, I don't really know. But for my generation, at any rate, I'm afraid that the transcendence of spirit was a phenomenon more talked about than felt. And in a sense, symbolic logic, you see, thanks to Mr. Freud and his friends, became our substitute for magic, and we tried, some of us, quite desperately to believe in it. But in sport, by comparison, one still has leg room, if I can permit myself just a bit of a pun there. Of course, one has to be a bit systematic when one trains and all that, but there's always a chance for magic to enter into. You see, there's always the possibility that some mysterious magnetic field will just simply stop all the clocks for one precious moment, defy all the laws of gravity and probability, and as it does so, pull us inexorably toward it, you see. The 0-minute mile, then, for sure. The very magic that poor Kafka always looked for and never found. The magic that our poor Bunny Rabbit, in his terror, should be quite unable to believe in, though, as I think I pointed out the beast as being frightfully uncooperative at the moment. Well, I don't know whether that answers your question.
Indeed, yes. Mr. Wynan, it's been an honor and a pleasure and indeed a revelation to talk with you and to tape your comments for the scene, and I do thank you.
Not at all. But I say, have you been recording at 7.5 per?
I believe so. Just let me check with the technician for a moment. Yes, he's nodding. Yes, we have. Why do you ask?
Well, it just occurred to me, and please don't feel that I'm meddling with your program, will you? But since we talked at such length about the possibility of bettering oneself through acceleration and all that, that on the replay, it might be rather cunning to try 15 IPS without dubbing the material across. I flatter myself my diction is quite up to double speed, and it would help to rub the massage in, as your Mr. McLuhan would say, wouldn't it?
We'll do what we can, sir. Thank you again.
Do you intend to replay at 15 inches per?
Oh, I think he was just putting us on, Glenn. But it is true, of course, that John Wynan's favorite symbol is the relationship of time to action. I'm not sure I understand all of his theories, of course.
They are complex, yes.
But what struck a responsive chord with me, and in fact, the reason I wanted to tape that interview was that for a man like Wynan, the intellectual and the athletic are two sides of one coin.
Obviously.
And personally, I find it quite, well, touching that as an athlete, he should constantly try to better his own best mark. You know, of course, that with minimal training, he managed the mile in 3:57 and 4/5 last year.
No, I didn't realize that.
And indeed, I mean, it'd be the equivalent of a duffer like me matching birdies with Jack Nicklaus. Wynan is absolutely world-class.
Really?
But as an artist, he continues to delve more and more deeply into the frustration of immobility. I mean, I didn't take in everything he said about the asymptotica.
Yeah.
After all, he was willing to admit that the concept was not yet entirely gelled in his own mind. But surely you'll admit that the sense of reality, of real time, challenged by one's physical capabilities that he derives from athletics, is probably a very necessary palliative to his introverted and highly complex work as an artist.
Well, Harry, I agree with you about the two sides of one coin business, but I found the interview sad rather than touching, as you describe it.
Really?
Yeah. After all, if I flip that coin, couldn't we say that the fear of decline, the fear of loss of power to which the stopwatch is going to bear witness one of these days, is a stand-in for the fear of death, really, and that if people like John Wynan, however lucidly they may describe their motivations, dwell upon that fear, which is really the fear of losing out in the ultimate competition with life itself, they must of necessity make it the very substance of their work. It's one thing to say that an artist describes in his work the way things are with the world. It's quite another when he has no alternative precisely because that's the way things are with him.
Oh, Glenn, you're impossible. I mean, that kind of idealism just isn't practical in the world as we know it.
Why not?
Well, I don't want to spout at you about schools of hard knocks and all that sort of thing, but it's obvious to me that one always measures oneself against the possibility of one's own failure, or against someone else's success, even if that someone else is represented by something relatively inanimate like a stopwatch. And without that measurement, it's just not athletics that would disappear, but art and the whole economic backbone of society as we know it.
Are you satisfied with society as we know it?
I get by, and so do you, which is why I don't know where all this idealism of yours is expected to lead us.
It's expected to lead us to the conclusion that we do have real power to change the world by
opting out?
By opting out creatively.
That's a contradiction in terms.
I don't think so. I think it's happening all around us. I also think that there's a younger generation than ours that doesn't have to struggle with that concept, to whom the idea that the competitive fact is not an inevitable component of life is no surprise at all, and who do program their lives without making allowances for it.
Are you trying to sell me on the neo-tribalism kick?
No, not really, because I suspect that competitive tribes got us into this mess in the first place. After all, what could be more tribal and competitive than the denizens of the Montreal Forum, according to their usual warm reception to the Toronto Maple Leafs? No, what I'm trying to sell you on, Harry, is the idea that one can bypass the whole problem.
How?
Well, in part through technology. You know, I produced a program for the CBC about 4 years ago having to do with the relationship between art and technology, and one of the participants was Jean Lemoyne. Have you heard of him?
He's a theologian, isn't he?
Yeah, among other things. And at that time, I think he was working for the National Film Board as a sort of technological advisor or something.
I see.
And when he was asked whether technology represented a threat to the survival of mankind, he answered in so remarkable and lyrical and, to borrow your description of wine and touching a manner, that I got out that tape the other day and wrote down some of his comments.
Which you're now going to read at me.
Which I'm now going to read at you, if you don't mind me shuffling a few papers for just one paragraph or so. And he said, and I quote, I will not attempt to do his accent, by the way, which is a lovely Quebecois accent, but I won't attempt it. I think technology exercises a charity upon which we have not yet reflected. There is a real charity in the machine, because it is there to help man. Of course it can be perverted. In that way, we are not very free among our creations. But in itself, it is good. It is the network of machines and techniques that encompasses the earth. It is the ensemble of all the networks: radio network, television network, oil network, hydraulic network, railroad network, telephone, telegraph, and all of that, so that it is impossible to consider a machine as isolated from the rest. It is part of all the rest. So that there is only one machine, in fact, encompassing the earth. And that has a meaning. That machine, stemming from the activity of man, is between man and nature like a second nature, offering to us its mediation. We cannot go to nature now without going through the network. Just as in the spiritual, we have to go through the Lamb. Okay, end of quote. What say you?
Well, it's everything you said. It's touching
It sure
and
is.
lyrical and all that, but I'm not quite sure what it's got to do with the plight of Team Canada.
Well, I think that if you really apply that idea, Harry, that properly used, there's a protective shield aspect to technology, which invalidates the necessity for human beings to measure themselves on a primarily physical and only secondarily spiritual scale. I think that a lot of the enterprises we tolerate in our society suddenly seem utterly irrelevant, and that's what it's got to do with the plight of Team Canada.
You don't think there's simply a Linus blanket aspect to technology when it's used in that way?
Well, I've no objection to that. If technology gives us an understanding of the firmament which invalidates some of our most cherished beliefs about our experiences on Earth, why not? I mean, I don't reject the frontier experience, which did demand a measurement of our power to cope with
Mother Nature.
Exactly. I don't reject that, but you and I are not frontiersmen. And it seems to me that you're arguing for the retention of values that may be all very nostalgia-inducing, but which are actually counterproductive in relation to our growth as human beings.
Glenn, I think you're distorting my position in this regard.
Do you realize that we're beginning to sound like Stanfield and Trudeau?
We are, aren't we?
Am I to understand that my honourable opponent feels that I am distorting his position?
Yes, that's quite right.
Perhaps you'd like to make one thing perfectly clear.
Yes, I would. Now, you're distorting my position because you're
Yes.
managing to overlook the fact that all the technological advance in the world does not necessarily alter the fundamental biological facts about man.
Well, I don't necessarily buy that altogether either.
Well, whether you do or not, I think it's true. And I want you to hear one more interview I taped earlier in the week.
And who was your victim this time?
My interview guest was Dr. Wolfgang von Kronkmeister, the eminent psychoanalyst.
Isn't he doing some special research at York University just now?
Yes, he is. And when he came to the studios, I played him the other two interviews.
Well, my basic impression of these tapes is that, unwittingly, of course, they contain a great many sexual references of one kind or another.
Sexual references, Doctor?
Yeah, well, this is almost inevitable, you see, because there are, of course, many important links between sex and athletics. To name only a few, the aspect of conquest, which is, of course, uppermost in athletics and also plays a very predominant role in sex, particularly in the fantasies with which we stimulate our sexual drives.
Doctor, are you suggesting that elements of sadism and masochism play a part in conventional sexual experience?
You use the word conventional. What do you think of when you use the word conventional?
Well, Doctor, I simply meant that for most men, sexual drives...
Are you saying men and not also saying women?
Well, there was really no particular reason for that, Doctor. I simply...
Allow me to suggest to you, my friends, that everything has a reason. Existence bequeaths to us only one function, and that is to discover the reason for existence, however unreasonable existence may be.
Well, Doctor, if I may return to the subject of the tapes...
Naturally.
I imagine you had very different reactions to those two remarkably different individuals.
No, on the contrary, I found them remarkably similar.
But surely...
But naturally, our second guest was a somewhat more sophisticated individual.
And therefore you'd like to spend the lion's share of your analysis on his comments.
What is making you say lion's share? This is usually the remark of either an exceedingly domineering individual or otherwise of an exceedingly insecure individual. Of course, I would have to examine your attitudes at much greater lengths, but I
Doctor, excuse me, but I would like to direct your attention to the individuals on the two tapes.
No, of course, I understand. Entirely you are defensive toward preparatory analysis. Now, whether or not you wish to submit to treatment is entirely your affair. I have never in my life solicited a patient. They must freely give themselves to me, put themselves absolutely in my hands. Otherwise, I am powerless to deal with their problems.
I understand, Doctor. Now, you were saying that you found our second guest more sophisticated.
Yeah, and therefore with a greater vocabulary, he can, of course, pull the sheet over our eyes more easily. In the first case, the patient was concerned about an inability to move either up or down what he described as a ladder. Now, we must ask ourselves what he meant by that.
Well, Doctor, in all fairness, I do believe that he was merely describing career problems peculiar to his function as a pugilist.
Permit me to say, my friends, that with experience we find that no career problem can be successfully bred in isolation. But perhaps you would prefer to supply your own diagnosis.
No, certainly not, Doctor. Your expert analysis is very valuable, I can assure you.
And yet you feel threatened by the power of my suggestions. You permit yourself a hostile reaction.
Certainly not, Doctor. Perhaps we could return our attention to subject number 2.
You were more attracted to him, were you not?
Absolutely not, Doctor.
Of course you were. We are always attracted by those who attempt to deceive us. To be deceived is the supreme compliment, the absolute recognition of the power which we potentially hold over the deceiver.
Do you really think that Jonathan Winan was attempting to deceive me, Doctor?
Of this there can be no question. What was all this talk of a rabbit? The rabbit is the symbol of fecundity.
Yes, that's very true.
Natürlich. Now, the experiment itself was by no means novel. As a matter of fact, it is remarkably similar to one which I am presently undertaking with the students at York University, with, however, one very great distinction, and that is that whereas in my experiment, I, who am controlling absolutely the destiny of the participants, remain out of the room at all times, your patient was in the room with the rabbit.
That's absolutely true.
Moreover, he had deliberately devised a control by which the rabbit was invited to proceed towards the door. Now, I don't need to tell you what that means symbolically.
No, Doctor, this is a family program. I think it'd be best if you did not.
And moreover, still he had so arranged matters that the rabbit, the symbol, as I have explained already, of fecundity, was less and less able to proceed towards that door.
That's fascinating, Doctor.
But, of course, it is a very simple case in which virility envy is transferred from those of one's own species towards whom one feels competitive to an altogether non-competing species, in this case that of the rabbit.
Doctor, that's an amazing deduction.
It is as child's play. I would also point out to you that the patient requested wanted you to remain in the room with the rabbit while he photographed this experiment. And this, of course, accomplished two things simultaneously. First of all, it reassured him that you were no more capable of that jump than was the rabbit. And it allowed him to employ the camera, which is, of course, as we know very well, the primary weapon of the voyeur.
Well, Doctor, that's an amazing diagnosis.
Not good.
And I would gather, then, that you yourself take a rather dim view of the competitive instinct.
There can be no question. If by some happy miracle the competitive factor were eliminated from our lives this very night, I would be walking the streets looking for work tomorrow morning.
Well, that is fascinating, Doctor. I do feel, though, that in view of the radical, though certainly logical thesis you proposed, and particularly in view of the possible damage it may have done to the reputation of our two guests, we should perhaps seek a second opinion.
That is entirely up to you.
Could you perhaps recommend one of your colleagues to whom we could refer the case?
Unfortunately, no. There is no one in the field capable of dealing with virility transference in the entirely thorough and at the same time utterly dispassionate manner with which I deal in this problem every hour of every day. Of course, if you wish to replace experience with inexperience, that is your affair entirely, and I will be returning to you the honorarium which you awarded me for this program.
No, Doctor, that won't be necessary
And
at
which
all.
I might mention does not even compensate me for 30 minutes consultation.
Doctor, please, no, that won't. Please don't do anything like that. It's been a great privilege to have had you as our guest on the scene and to have gained some understanding of your views on competition.
Tell me something, my friend. Are you a religious man?
As a matter of fact, yes, Doctor. I've always held myself...
Is there a Bible at the CBC?
As a matter of fact, there is. The Gideon Society provides one for each of the announce booths.
Then on one of those Bibles will you absolutely swear to me that you will not consult any of my colleagues on this matter?
Doctor, I give you my word.
Very well. I bid you guten Tag.
And I assume you kept your word.
The corporation's honorarium is its bond, Glenn. But, whatever our differences on the subject of competition, we've covered a fair bit of ground in the last half hour.
We sure have.
Certainly, I feel that we've gained a good many yards rushing.
And just think of all the passes you've intercepted.
Well, anyway, life goes on no matter what you think of the competitive spirit, Glenn. Sport flourishes, Team Canada looks to its laurels, and Montreal has the Olympics in 76.
That's good.
Well, I think so, and so, for that matter, does Duncan Hay Guinness.
Who is Duncan Hay Guinness?
Glenn, I'm surprised at you. You're supposed to be an Arctic buff, a walking dictionary of tundra and taiga data.
Well, it's a hobby, Harry, but I can't claim to be on a first-name basis with all the residents of the NWT.
Well, Duncan Hay Guinness, for your information, is Canada's king of the kayak, and certainly our best hope for an Olympic gold medal in 76. You must have heard of it.
No, I haven't.
Well, for 15 years, ever since he left his native Scotland, he's been picking up the finer points of kayaking from the Eskimos at Coral Harbour, Southampton Island. Until even the elders of the tribe admit that they have nothing more to teach him. And he's on the line right now from that remote outpost.
You mean I finally get to do an interview?
I'll handle the interviews if you don't mind, Mr. Gould,
Oh,
but
if you say
you can
so.
at least say hello to the gentleman. Mr. Hay Guinness?
And tell the wee ones to stop badgering the muskox and get in for dinner immediately.
Mr. Hay Guinness, this is Harry Brown in Toronto. How are you today?
And tell them at the Hudson Bay while you're at it that we did settle the account last month, and I have no intention of putting up with their impertinence any longer.
He doesn't seem to hear us, Harry.
Hello, Mr. Hay Guinness. I have Glenn Gould here with me at the CBC in Toronto.
Good afternoon, sir.
You got it ahead and get the table set, lass. I'll get rid of these fellas from the CBC just as soon as possible. It's probably one of those socialistic programs anyway.
There seems to be some problems on the line.
Yeah, but I've always wanted to see Coral Harbour, and it's just very exciting to hear any sound from that far north.
Mr. Hay Guinness, this is Harry Brown in Toronto. Can you hear me now?
I certainly can. You're coming through loud and clear.
Well, sir, we've been having a discussion with Mr. Glenn Gould about the merits of sport.
There could be very little room for discussion about that.
Well, Mr. Gould claims that competition in all forms represents a serious threat to society, and since you're training for the Olympics in 76,
Aye, that I am.
we felt you might care to comment on the subject.
Well, I believe it's very important to realise that in sports as a whole, you have to understand them and the like.
There it goes again.
Oh, dear, if we get him back, find out what the temperature is out there, will you, Harry?
Okay. Mr. Hay Guinness, can you hear me?
I've already told you that I can hear you.
Yes, well, we were cut off for just a moment, sir, but you were saying?
I was saying that it is important to realise that in sports as a whole, the true foundation is not competition, but rather the
Mr. Hay Guinness, we're still having line trouble in the studio. Can you hear me now?
Of course I can, but I don't know why we taxpayers have to put up with so incompetent
competent broadcasting organization.
Well, I'm sorry for the interruption, sir. You were saying that the important thing is not
That's correct. The important thing, the only thing that matters in sport, in my humble opinion, the only thing which we hope to stress in Montreal in 76 is communication with our fellow man. I firmly believe that.
Well, that's an interesting point of view. You say that sports represents a means of communication. Is that right, Mr. Hay Guinness? Mr. Hay Guinness, are you still there? Operator?
This is a recording. The number you have reached is not a working number. Please consult your directory for further information. This is a recording. The number you have reached is not a working number. Please consult your directory.
I am just a poor boy, though my story is seldom told. I have squandered my resistance for a pocket full of mumbles, such are promises. All lies and jest, still a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. When I left my home and my family, I was no more than a boy in the company of strangers, in the quiet of the railway station, running scared. Laying low, seeking out the poorer quarters where the ragged people go, looking for the places only they would know. Lie-la-lie, lie-la-lie-lie, lie-la-lie, lie-la-lie, lie-la-lie-lie-lie-lie, lie-la-lie-lie. Asking only workmen's wages, I come looking for a job, but I get no offers. Just to come on from the whores on 7th Avenue. I do declare there were times when I was so lonesome I took some comfort there. La 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 la. Then I'm laying out my winter clothes and wishing I was gone, going home, where the New York City winters are bleeding me, bleeding me. Stands a boxer and a fighter by his trade, and he carries the reminders of every glove that laid him down or cut him till he cried out in his anger and his shame, I am leaving, but the fighter still remains. Lie-la-lie, lie-la-la-la, lie-la-lie. Lie la lie, lie la la la, lie la lie, la 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 lie, lie la la la, lie la lie, lie la lie, lie la la la, lie la lie, la 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 lie, lie la la la.
On the scene this week, our extensive look at sports was produced by Ross Perigo and written, all of it, no matter what the script said, by Glenn Gould, who also impersonated Domenico Pastrano, Jonathan Wyman, Dr. Wolfgang von Klonkmeister, and Mr. Duncan Hay Guinness, and for this achievement has been awarded lifetime membership in the Frank Gorshin Society of America. Mr. Gould also attempted to impersonate yours truly, Harry Brown, and for that effort received a fat lip and a summons to appear before the executive jury of the Announcers Union. And having given credit where credit is due, it only remains to say that This was The Scene,